Did you watch our coverage of the Independent Press Gallery's conservative leadership debate the other night? Leslyn Lewis said she had an earache, so she pulled out at the last minute, and then Peter MacKay used that as an excuse to drop out too. So it turned into a calmer affair, not a debate, but two fireside chats in a row hosted by our friend Andrew Lawton. To tell you the truth, I thought that fireside chat format was excellent because Andrew Lawton did such a good job of it. It was actually a great night. And because it was the first independent press gallery event, there's not a government press gallery event, we were allowed to join. And so all of our reporters were there and they all had questions for the candidates. It was a great evening. Let me show you one question and answer. It's by our newest reporter, Drea Humphrey. She flew in from BC. And unfortunately, the clock ran out, so Drea didn't get a chance to pose a follow-up question. But listen to this one.
Hi, thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm Drea Humphrey with RebelNews. And my question for you today is, if vaccines do end up becoming mandated by Justin Trudeau or health authorities, what do you think will happen and should happen to those who refuse to take the vaccine?
Well, I think, people should never be forced to do anything in a modern democratic society. What I think we haven't had in Canada is a proper and responsible debate on a whole range of things, including masks. In fact, Derek was attacked for questioning the chief public health officer. I was critical of the Trudeau government for not talking and debating about masks. The vaccine issue will be even more important, where people will have to see the evidence, see the clinical studies, and be able to make a decision. With rights and responsibilities, that gives free choice, which I defend and support. But it may, as people make that choice, there may be responsibilities that flow from it that limit their ability in some circumstances if we're in a second wave or major social distancing decisions come back. We will have to weigh how many people have been immunized to see if we have a herd immunity approach. I try and study the science, but I think in a democratic society like ours, there is not a forcing of anything on anyone.
Good question. And a vague answer. Of course, Erin O'Toole is not going to say he's for forcible vaccines. Imagine police literally holding someone down and jabbing a needle into them with some serum made in China, because about 90% of our meds are made in China these days. And bizarrely, Trudeau just signed a contract with CanSino, I don't know how to say it. It's a Chinese company affiliated with the People's Liberation Army. So we've contracted with the Chinese army to pay them to do research on a vaccine. And believe it or not, part of Canada's deal is that we're going to have Canadians in Nova Scotia be the human guinea pigs to test this vaccine. Yeah, what could go wrong with that? We're literally paying the Chinese military to make vaccines, and we're going to test it on Canadians. Did you know that Trudeau has already bought 37 million syringes, which just happens to work out to exactly one syringe per person in Canada, even for babies? So yeah, what do you think is coming? A made-in-China vaccine that will be given to 37 million of us. So Erin O'Toole said he believed in consent, but he didn't explain what consequences there would be for people who did not consent to the vaccine. He didn't say what he thought Trudeau would do, and he didn't say what he himself would do if he were in charge. And it's not an idle question. Here's Theresa Tam, Canada's public health doctor, who has blundered through the pandemic, flip-flopping on every issue from masks to borders, blaming everyone as racists if they were even worried at first, and throughout it all, obeying her masters at the World Health Organization, where she has worked throughout this whole crisis. Unbelievable conflict of interest. But here she is a few years back in a National Film Board movie talking about a hypothetical pandemic and what she thinks would happen. Listen to this.
I think the public has to know this is one of the worst case scenarios in terms of an infectious disease outbreak, in that their cooperation is sought. If there are people who are non-compliant, there are definitely laws and public health powers that can quarantine people in mandatory settings. It's potential you could track people, put bracelets on their arms, have police and other setups to ensure quarantine is undertaken. It is better to be preemptive and precautionary and take the heat of people thinking you might be overreactionary, get ahead of the curve, and then think about whether you've overreacted later. But it's such a serious situation that I think decisive early action is the key.
So jail for people who don't take vaccines, trackable bracelets, police and handcuff stuff. So like Erin O'Toole says, you're not forced to take a vaccine. You're just thrown in jail if you don't. Your choice, mate, jail or vaccine. I actually watched that whole National Film Board movie. It's called Outbreak. I have to say I liked the movie. It was very interesting to me because it had a creative idea, juxtapose a historian's telling of the great epidemic in Montreal 135 years ago with smallpox with what would happen if an outbreak of smallpox were to happen today. So the history part was just plain interesting. I didn't know about that smallpox epidemic of 1885. And the today part was interesting as a thought experience, which is what it was when the movie was made. But it was twice as interesting given that we're living through it actually now. And what happened in real life was in many ways worse than the scenario in the National Film Board movie because it's never ending. In the movie, it ended, but here's our own Drea Humphrey making a very interesting point.
But if the measure of wearing a mask when you're healthy is simply because of a what if in the future, in particular the upcoming flu season, doesn't that mean we would always be wearing a mask for what if? It makes you wonder since none of these bylaws have an end date on them.
That's a good point, isn't it? The mask bylaws we have now, they're not necessary. The pandemic's over, statistically speaking. They're not even being justified as being necessary. They're preventative now, but they have no end date. There is no end. It's a permanent panic, or at least long enough to tide us over until some hasty vaccine from the People's Liberation Army is ready to be stuck in your arm. Yeah, you go first, Justin. Let's see you poke that made-in-China needle into your own dear children's arm first before I do. Actually, I don't want to see that because I bear no malice towards Trudeau's children. I don't want them to be guinea pigs either. And luckily, children don't get the coronavirus. I mean, they can carry the virus, but they don't usually get sick from it. And in the country of 37 million people, with about 10 million people who are either babies or kids or teenagers, about 10 million, a grand total of 1 child has died from the virus, and they had a terminal illness to begin with. 1 out of 10 million. So the odds of dying as a child from the coronavirus is 1 in 10 million, if at all. You have a greater chance of dying from lightning, greater chance of dying from a bear attack or some extremely unlikely event. 1 in 10 million. In fact, I wouldn't even say that it's that high because that one kid was already dying from something else, I'm sorry to say. Do you think that a virus vaccine hastily concocted by China's People's Liberation Army and jabbed into 10 million arms of Canadian kids, do you think that will have fewer than a 1 in 10 million chance of causing a side effect? Yeah. You use a vaccine to protect yourself from risk. That's the whole point. But there is no risk to children. None. 1 in 10 million, if you want to be precise. But why would you inject something cooked up by the Chinese government's army into your arm if there's no risk for you? Why would you do it to anyone, let alone a kid? Not even 9,000 deaths of any age in Canada from the virus. That's the same as the average annual deaths from the flu and pneumonia. Despite Theresa Tam predicting up to 350,000 deaths. She's not good at predictions, but you heard her. She likes to overreact. She likes to use a sledgehammer on other people, not herself. Here's the historian from that documentary, Michael Bliss, in an article writing about how the smallpox vaccine was tried on Montrealers back in 1885 during the epidemic. There, let me read from the Globe and Mail. In 1885, public health officials in Montreal, then Canada's largest city, tried to stop a small outbreak of smallpox by offering extensive public vaccination. There was a tradition of suspicion about vaccination in Quebec, a tendency to take smallpox for granted as one of the many diseases sent by God to punish sinners. When the first vaccines used in Montreal turned out to be contaminated, causing cases of erysipelas, fear of the vaccine became greater than fear of smallpox. Hey guys, totally safe, trust us. So yeah, mandatory vaccines. Look at this from that same movie, Outbreak, by the National Film Board.
Le Bureau de santé était convaincu que seule la vaccination pouvait empêcher la variole de s'étendre. Donc, on a proposé la vaccination obligatoire.
Though all the powerful voices, including the Catholic Church, are calling for compulsory vaccination, many in the streets are prepared to resist.
September 28th. Angry crowds assemble in front of the health office on St. Catherine Street. Speeches are made. The crowd applauds and jeers at the authorities. Someone casts the first stone. One of the health office windows shatters, then the others. After half an hour, a cry goes up, "À l'Hôtel de Ville," to City Hall. The crowd, 1,000 strong, heads off down St. Catherine Street, stoning all front windows, then masses in front of City Hall, shouting, "Down with compulsory vaccination!" All the police in the building are issued rifles with bayonets. The chief of police arrives at last, orders the rifles put away, and organizes sallies of club-wielding policemen who gradually drive off the angry crowd. By 1 in the morning, the rioters have fled, and the city is quiet again.
Now, in the end, about 3,000 people died from smallpox in that 1885 epidemic in Montreal. But remember, that's out of a total population back then of around 200,000 people. So that is a huge death toll. If you extrapolate that to the size of Canada today, it would be like 500,000 Canadians dying out of 37 million. So it would be a huge tragedy. It would be worse even than Theresa Tam's worst predictions. But in fact, fewer than 9,000 Canadians have died from the coronavirus, same as the average flu season. There were riots back then in Montreal against mandatory vaccinations. And as the contaminated vaccine story shows, the riots were not baseless. Don't jab me with your needle. But at least back then, the authorities had an excuse. The smallpox plague was truly devastating. Imagine 500,000 dead Canadians today. That's what proportionally happened to Montreal in 1885. But Canada in 2020, 9,000. And outside of Ontario and Quebec, really, outside of seniors' homes and foreign migrant farm laborer bunkhouses, there hasn't even been a pandemic. I'm sorry, you cannot call 194 deceased people in all of British Columbia, 5 million people. I'm sorry, you can't call that a pandemic. Average age of the deceased, 85 years old. The youngest person in BC who died, 47. It is not a pandemic in BC. They don't need masks, so they certainly don't need vaccines. They certainly don't need ones cooked up in a hurry by the Chinese army. You know what they need? They need a solution to opioid drugs, which have killed 600 people so far this year. So yeah, masks. What's that all about? It's about conditioning you, getting you used to being afraid, getting you used to obeying. And when will the masks end, Ezra asks? Well, that's easy. They'll end only when you take a vaccine made in China. Or if Theresa Tam gets her way, no problem. You don't have to take the vaccine. Just go to jail. That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to RebelNews.com.